We know, at least according to legend, that upon first seeing the hilltop that's now home to Kenyon College, Bishop Philander Chase uttered the immortal words, "This will do." What we don't know is the tone of voice in which he uttered them. The hilltop Kenyon now calls home was not Chase's first choice. In fact, it wasn't even his second. And he had traveled a long, hard road to get there. When Chase, thank you, Kim, that red line is still there. When Chase first came to Ohio from Connecticut in 1817, he settled in the small village of Worthington, which had been founded by Episcopal deacon James Kilbourne in 1793, 10 years before Ohio became a state. At the age of 42, Chase had given up the comforts of the rectorship of Christ Church in Hartford, Connecticut, to follow the flood of fellow Connecticut residents into the wilds of the former Western Reserve and neighboring territories. By 1818, Chase had been elected the first bishop of the fledgling Diocese of Ohio. A man with a missionary spirit, Chase knew that the newly opened land would have an ongoing need for a large supply of well-educated clergymen, a supply that was unlikely to come from the more settled East. So the bishop set about creating his own seminary to fulfill that need. With the backing of the diocese, he planned at first to locate the institution on his farm in Worthington, but upon reflection decided that it would be best to remove his students from what he called the vice and dissipation of urban life. The prejudice behind Chase's statement, which was typical among people of his era, especially college founders, had lasting implications for many of the colleges founded at that time. It quickly became apparent to Chase that in order for his seminary to survive, he would also need to provide education at the grammar school and college levels. Such a comprehensive institution would have the benefit of being attractive to more students, and the tuition of those in the grammar school and college would subsidize that of the seminarians. However, the site along Alum Creek that he had first chosen for the institution was found wanting by others in the diocese, and Chase was prevented from pursuing his plan there. Despite this setback, Chase set out in 1823 to raise funds in England, where he once again encountered his strong enemy, John Henry Hobart, the Bishop of New York. Hobart, who had spoken out against the plans for an Episcopal institution in the West, was engaged in raising funds in England for the General Theological Seminary in New York City. However, Chase found an equally strong ally in the American statesman Henry Clay, who was then attending to political affairs in England. Clay introduced him to Lord Gambier, an admiral in the Royal Navy and a fellow negotiator of the Treaty of Ghent, who in turn introduced him to other prominent men and women in the Anglican Church. Among them were Lord Kenyon, son of the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, for whom the title of Lord Kenyon had been created, and Anglo-Irish aristocrat Lady Jane King Parsons, the Dowager Countess of Rosse. They would become, along with Gambier, the college's earliest benefactors, as would others whose names are memorialized on campus and in the village. On July 24th, 1825, almost exactly a year after he had sailed home from England, and just 7 months after Kenyon was chartered, Chase held services in the tiny village of Mount Vernon. The next day, he rode into the countryside with the young lawyer Henry Curtis, who hoped to interest him in a parcel of land owned by his wife's uncle, a Mr. William Hogg of Brownsville, Pennsylvania. Just south of Hanna Hall, the Celtic cross donated to the college by the Bexley Hall class of 1902 stands on the site where Chase supposedly stood when he made the momentous decision to locate his college on the hilltop. The occasion is celebrated in the mural by Norris Rahming, a Kenyon art professor and administrator, that decorates the north wall of the Gambier Post Office today. Many in the diocese were unhappy with the selection, and there are some indications that Chase himself wasn't altogether charmed by the site, which was probably a bit less civilized and perhaps a bit more isolated than even he might have liked. He insisted, for example, upon calling Owl Creek, what we now know as the Kokosing, the Vernon River, perhaps to make it sound less redolent of the frontier. Nevertheless, he immediately set about carving a college out of the 4,000 acres of wilderness that the diocese agreed to purchase. Over time, more than 3,000 of that 4,000 acres, plus an additional 4,000 bought as an investment, would be sold off to support the institution's operations. Here you can see the pink inset area is the village of Gambier. What is surrounding it in the sort of ivory color is College Township, which is the smallest township in the state of Ohio. The college's first buildings were rough log structures, providing little more than basic shelter from the elements, and sometimes not even that. Among those first buildings were the home of Chase and his family, known in jest as the Bishop's Palace, which was located just north of where the Church of the Holy Spirit now stands. To the south, in the area between present-day Ransom and Ascension Halls, stood the grammar school and chapel, known as Old 74. A drawing of the interior of Old 74 shows that accommodations were rough indeed, as attested to by the letters and memoirs of early students. Various explanations have been proposed for the origin of the name Old 74, ranging from the number of windows to the resemblance to a particular type of fighting ship common at the time. The first permanent building, what we now know as Old Kenyon.
Yeah.
Well, I can't. You want to turn it on?
Yeah. I think it loses something without it.
The first permanent building, the one we now know as Old Kenyon, was begun in 1827 and first occupied in 1829, while the east and west wings, which were redesigned by the College of Professor Marcus Tullius Cicero Wing, probably the all-time greatest Kenyon name, were not completed until the mid-1830s. The construction of Old Kenyon's massive walls, 4 feet thick at their bases, at a time when the War of 1812 was still fresh in the minds of local inhabitants, gave rise to fears that the many English quarrymen, stonecutters, and masons at work on the project, as well as the students, were in fact British soldiers building and manning a fortress on the hilltop. Contrary to college legend, the bulk of the structure was designed not by the great American architect Charles Bulfinch, famed for his designs of Faneuil Hall in Boston and the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., but by Norman Nash, an Episcopal clergyman and amateur architect with assistance from Chase himself. We know from his writings that Chase had fallen in love with Gothic architecture, which was closely associated with Christianity. During this time in England, when he visited the colleges of Oxford University and numerous cathedrals, Chase met Bulfinch, again through his friendship with Henry Clay, while in Washington seeking congressional funds for the college in 1828, and the architect contributed a revised design for the building's steeple and other ornamentation along its roofline. In February 1949, Old Kenyon was destroyed in a catastrophic fire that took the lives of 9 students. Because the structure's symbolic value was so great, there was little hesitation in deciding to rebuild, although it meant putting other construction projects, including a library and a gymnasium, on hold. Old Kenyon's charred walls were carefully taken down to allow a new fireproof superstructure to be put in place. And then reassembled in their pre-fire formations. The only change made to the exterior was the placement of a row of 4th floor dormers on the south face. Although some have challenged the generally accepted claim that Old Kenyon is the first collegiate Gothic structure in America, it does predate by at least several years surviving buildings in this style at other colleges. Architectural historians tend to date the beginning of the Gothic revival in America to the early 1820s, when the Gothic style became popular for churches, but it did not become common at colleges until the 1850s. The term collegiate Gothic was coined during that period by the noted architect Alexander Jackson Davis, who used it to describe buildings such as those he designed for the Virginia Military Institute, which still exists, and others that have been lost to fire, neglect, and changing tastes. It's certain, however, that Chase chose the style, as he would later at his Jubilee College in Illinois, to emphasize ties with England and the English church. It's also clear that he was keenly aware of the architecture's capacity to inspire. Chase's correspondence with Kenyon benefactors is filled with lyrical descriptions of the developing campus. In an 1829 letter to Lord Gambier, he wrote that, quote, "The steeple of Old Kenyon is in good proportion, high and beautiful. As you approach it, thoughts of the past and future force themselves on your mind," close quote. There's little doubt that not only Chase, but also other college builders of the period were looking to English, and specifically medieval English, models for their institutions. Chase's notes from his visits to Oxford make it clear that he admired the town's colleges for their venerability and their air of piety made manifest. It's likely that other American visitors with collegiate ties shared his sentiments and brought them into the planning for other campuses as well. Unlike their English counterparts, however, most American campuses of the period remained relatively open and outward-looking, rather than closed and inward-looking. The word campus, for the Latin for field or open plain, was first used to describe the grounds of a college in regard to Princeton University, then known as the College of New Jersey, in the late 18th century. Some of the historical reasons for the enclosed quadrangles, such as protection from the often demonstrated animosity of townspeople towards scholars in medieval times, didn't apply in the New World, but more importantly, because most American campuses of the 18th and early 19th centuries grew up in rural areas, space was not a major concern. At Kenyon, it's been observed, the organization of the campus and village, with their orientation toward Middle Path, owes more to Williamsburg, with its central axis aligned with the original building, than to medieval English university towns. By the end of the 19th century, campuses composed of one or more large-scale enclosed quadrangles, exemplified by those at Stanford University and the University of Chicago, would become much more popular, as with the addition of such quadrangles to existing campuses, notably at Duke, Princeton, and Yale universities. Almost every American campus built before that time, however, began with a single, often monumental structure that housed every operation of the institution. In Gambier, that building was the one we now know as Old Kenyon, but which was, at least in the early years, referred to simply as Kenyon College. Rosse Hall, Kenyon's second permanent building, was begun in 1829. The site for the college's first chapel, which Chase imagined as a vast Gothic structure that would preside at the western edge of one of the academical squares he envisioned for the hilltop, was chosen because it was the highest on the plateau, enjoying a splendid view of the surrounding countryside. By the time Chase left Gambier in September 1831, however, only the chapel's foundation had been laid, and it would be another 14 years before the structure in much altered form was completed. The building, in its final Greek Revival style, was designed by Charles Romanov Przemyrsky, then a teacher of modern languages at the college. Although it was no longer used as a chapel following completion of Kenyon's Church of the Holy Spirit in 1871, Rosse Hall has gone on to serve the college in a variety of capacities. Gutted by a fire in 1897, it was quickly rebuilt as the gymnasium, not only for Kenyon, but also for the Harcourt Play School for Girls. It has also been used as a dance hall, a lecture venue, a theater for both drama productions and movies, and for a few memorable days in the spring of 1970, a gathering place for the entire community in the wake of the fatal shootings of 4 student protesters by Ohio National Guard troops at Kent State University. A 1975 remodeling made the building a first-rate concert facility and restored its most distinctive feature, the wood-paneled ceiling, to its former glory after years of being hidden by acoustical tile. Behind Rosse Hall, and now behind Storer Hall as well, sits the college cemetery, which dates to Kenyon's earliest years. The first interment was recorded in 1827. For much of the early to middle 19th century, until the time of the Civil War, it served as the primary burial site for the village as well as the college. The next permanent structure to be built on the hill was Bexley Hall, situated facing Old Kenyon at the far end of the plateau, with between 3 and 4/5 of a mile separating the 2 buildings' front doors. At least one historian has suggested that Chase was inspired by the U.S. Constitution with its requirement for the separation of church and state in his plan to so separate his seminary from his college. With support obtained by Charles Pettit McIlvaine, Chase's successor as Bishop of Ohio and president of the college, from Nicholas Van Sittart, Lord Bexley, the distinguished English architect Henry Roberts was engaged in 1835 to design the building. The cornerstone was not laid until 1839, however, because the funds for the building's construction were needed elsewhere. Although it was first occupied in 1843, Bexley Hall was not fully completed until 1858. Also at the northern edge of campus, the Kenyon brothers of Delta Kappa Epsilon appropriated an abandoned cabin in the woods to the west of Bexley Hall in 1853 for their meetings and rituals. As architectural historian Paul Venable Turner observes in his book, Campus and American Planning Tradition, these students were, quote, indulging fully the American romance of collegiate life in the purity of nature, close quote. In so doing, they were also laying claim to the honor of owning the first fraternity lodge in America. When David Bates Douglas first set foot in Gambier in 1840 as the college's third president, he found 3 major buildings on the hilltop, several private residences, numerous temporary or incomplete structures, and a general air of disarray. Piles of discarded building materials sat next to rotting stumps. The, quote, investigating snouts of roving swine, end quote. I love that bunch of words. To use historian George Franklin Smythe's colorful description, saw to it that no seedling was able to become firmly rooted. The ideal of the campus beautiful had been lost in the college's mid-century scramble for solvency, but Douglas was determined it would be regained. A former West Point professor and a skilled engineer with a passion for order, he laid out the College Park, or Marriott Park, so named for benefactor George Wharton Marriott, not long after his arrival on campus. Douglas also constructed the pillars and gates and built Middle Path from there to Old Kenyon in 1842. Much of the village of Gambier was still engulfed in mud, though, for many months of the year and for some time to come. The next man to have a lasting impact on the architecture of the campus was Gregory Thurston Bedell, who became the 3rd Bishop of Ohio in 1859. It was he who extended Middle Path northward from the gatepost to Bexley Hall, and it was he who planted the trees along its length. His wish was that the northern portion of the path would be called the Bishop's Walk. That desire went unfulfilled, though, with the entirety called Middle Path from almost the beginning. In the middle of the 19th century, William Tinsley was perhaps the most popular college architect in the Midwest, designing buildings for Kenyon, Indiana University, the University of Wisconsin, and Wabash College, among others. A close friend of Bedell as a result of his work on several churches in the diocese, Tinsley designed the Bishop's Gambier home, known as Kokosing, in 1864. His most outstanding contribution to the campus is Ascension Hall, shown here in an etching shortly after its completion, and again in a photograph taken a bit later in the 19th century. I love this photograph for many reasons, but primarily because of the baseball game being played and with at least one person on the field wearing a top hat and several people who are among the onlookers wearing those as well. In all likelihood, Tinsley was also responsible for some details of the house long known as Clifford Place for owner Peter Neff's daughter, Clifford, or Neff Cottage, which served for many years as the home of the college's Dean of Students. Following a thorough renovation and restoration in 2008 and 2009, the building, now known as Finn House, for the parents of benefactor James Finn of the class of 1970, houses the offices of the Kenyon Review, while an addition built to recall an earlier outbuilding on the site holds the Cheever Room for seminars, readings, and other events. Ascension Hall is considered by Tinsley's biographer, J.D. Forbes, to be the architect's masterpiece. Built of olive shale, the same locally quarried stone used in Kokosing, the Church of the Holy Spirit, and Christ Church at the Quarry, known familiarly as Quarry Chapel, the structure was a gift of the congregation of the Church of the Ascension in New York City. Among its outstanding features are the second and third floor lecture halls, Phi Lambda Thesian and Nu Pi Kappa, respectively, which were assigned to the college's two literary societies, which maintained their libraries and hosted events there. Another of Tinsley's surviving buildings was also in Knox County, but not at Kenyon. Quarry Chapel, located about a mile northeast of Gambier at the intersection of Quarry Chapel and Monroe Mills Roads, is sometimes incorrectly attributed not to Tinsley, but to its builder, William Fish. Still another, the massive four-story Knox County Infirmary, also known as the Knox County Home in Bangs, could, until 2015, be glimpsed from US 36, a few miles southwest of Mount Vernon. The long-abandoned structure, charitably described by the architect's biographer as, quote, definitely not one of Tinsley's more successful works, close quote, had most recently served as the home of the now defunct Mount Vernon Bible College before being destroyed by a June 2015 fire. Constructed between 1869 and 1871, the Church of the Holy Spirit was another gift of the Church of the Ascension, which Gregory Thurston Bedell had served as rector for many years before coming to Ohio, and whose rector in 1869 was the Reverend John Cotton Smith, son of the Reverend Thomas Smith, a former Kenyon president. While the design of the chapel is sometimes credited to Bedell and his wife, it is actually the work of Detroit architect Gordon Lloyd. Noted primarily for ecclesiastical buildings such as Pittsburgh Trinity Cathedral, with their characteristic stepped buttresses, narrow elongated doors and windows, and off-center bell towers. The chapel's striking interior is highlighted by such features as a barrel vaulted ceiling, decorative wall paintings of passages from the scriptures, and the early 20th century Brooke Memorial windows by Philadelphia's renowned D'Ascenzo stained glass studios. In the first quarter of the 20th century, several leading architects of the period contributed notable buildings to the campus. Probably the best known of these at the time was Charles Schweinfurth, a Cleveland architect who had trained under the great Boston architect Henry Hobson Richardson. Many of Schweinfurth's 19th century buildings are in the Romanesque revival and shingle styles most closely associated with Richardson. But by the early 20th century, when Schweinfurth first worked for Kenyon, he'd begun to design more buildings with Gothic revival elements. Schweinfurth's first building for the college was the Tudor Gothic Hanna Hall, funds for which were provided by U.S. Senator Marcus Hanna to honor his wife, Charlotte Augusta Rhodes Hanna. Nevertheless, when he announced his gift, Hanna said he wished the dormitory to be called the Politician's Barracks. Like the Bishop's Walk, though, the name never caught on with the students. Completed in 1903, Hanna is constructed of rusticated sandstone with bold ashlar moldings and string courses. The focal point of the facade is the arched entrance with its perpendicular Gothic ornament. What might have been its most striking feature, though, was never built, with the college deciding to forego construction of a 1.5-story hall and billiard room akin to the Norton Room in Ransom Hall that Schweinfurth had intended for the rear of the building in order to take advantage of the view from that spot into the Kokosing Valley. Also for Kenyon, Schweinfurth designed Alumni Library, now known as Ransom Hall, to replace Hubbard Hall, the college's first separate library building. The most distinctive feature of the Tudor Gothic building is the Norton Room, constructed as a reading room with funds provided by trustee David C. Norton of Cleveland, for whom Schweinfurth had designed a home in 1897. In its years as a library, the building held a magazine room, a cataloging room, seminar rooms, and a boardroom, while the bulk of the book collection was stored in the stacks in Stevens Hall, which had survived the 1910 fire that destroyed Hubbard Hall. As the college's supervising architect, Schweinfurth also took on two vast remodeling projects. In 1913, he designed a complete interior makeover for Bexley Hall, which remained the seat of the seminary at that time. His alterations accommodated St. Mary's Chapel on the building's west end and a large lounge on the east, both with distinctive golden oak paneling. Similar paneling decorated the interior of Colburn Hall, a 1904 library addition to Bexley Hall, whose exterior was designed by the Cleveland firm of Bennis and Hubble, but whose interior was by Schweinfurth. Sadly, almost all traces of the architect's work on the northern end of campus have been obliterated. The same is true of his work on Old Kenyon, which was limited to the interior and which was destroyed in the 1949 fire. A tribute to William Andrew Leonard, the fourth Bishop of Ohio, and the memory of his wife, Sarah Sullivan Leonard, Leonard Hall, was constructed with $200,000 in contributions from Ohio Episcopal churchmen. It was the campus's first building designed by architect Abram Garfield, a son of U.S. President James A. Garfield. A collegiate Gothic structure built of Briar Hill sandstone, Leonard Hall was first occupied in September 1924. You can see in this photograph, which was taken shortly before the building opened, that what we now think of as the Beta Rock was located in front of the Psi Hue division at the time. Although it too is sometimes mistakenly attributed to Schweinfurth, who died in 1919, Samuel Mather Hall was designed by Garfield as well. The style is perpendicular Gothic with Briar Hill sandstone for the main body of the building and Indiana limestone for the trim. At the time of its completion in 1925, Samuel Mather Hall was considered one of the most advanced science education facilities in the country. It was widely imitated on other campuses during the following decades. Just before the market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression put an end to building plans on countless campuses, Kenyon was able to construct one of its most handsome and useful facilities. With a gift of $300,000 from financier William Nelson Cromwell and attorney Frank Hadley Ginn of the class of 1890 for the building itself, and $70,000 from the Episcopal Diocese of Ohio for the Philander Chase Memorial Tower, the college was able to realize its dream of a commons and dining hall to replace the building at 105 Chase Avenue that now houses the Office of Development. That structure, originally a store, then served solely and by all accounts poorly as a dining facility. Among the most celebrated features of the new structure were the Great Hall, which set a new standard for elegance in collegiate dining facilities, along with the East Terrace, with its stunning view of Knox County fields and forests, and the finely detailed Peirce Lounge. Peirce Hall was the third campus building to be designed by Chicago architect Alfred Granger, an 1887 graduate of Kenyon. The first was Stevens Hall, while the second was Cromwell Cottage. the president's residence, and another gift of William Nelson Cromwell. Like Schweinfurth, Granger, who was noted for the artistry and ease with which he could meld motifs from historical styles and the then popular arts and crafts movement, was one of several of the campus's architects to pass at the beginning of his career through the offices of H.H. Richardson's Boston firm, currently known as Shepley Bulfinch. On the occasion of Peirce Hall's dedication in 1929, an understandably delighted President William Foster Peirce was heard to comment that it was the last building Kenyon would ever need. Fortunately, it was one of the few times in his 41 years as president that he could have been accused of a lack of foresight. Nevertheless, for a while at least, it looked as if Peirce's prediction might be accurate. During the 1930s and early 1940s, only two structures, both designed by Cleveland architect Charles Bacon Rowley, and both donated by Charles A. Shaffer of the class of 1883, were added to the campus. The Shaffer Pool building, with its glass-roofed pool that gave rise to the nickname the Glass House, was completed in 1936. Now known as Bolton Dance Studio, it was converted to its current use in 1981. The Shaffer Speech Building, with its proscenium staged Hill Theater, opened in 1941. When Gordon Keith Chalmers came to the college's helm beginning in 1937, it became increasingly clear that there were several buildings that would be needed if Kenyon was to fulfill the ambitious new president's goals. Chief among these facilities would be a new library, for which Chalmers chose a site along Middle Path that would require moving the structure we now know as Bailey House. Although plans were drawn up as early as 1938 by well-known library architect Alfred Morton Githens, other priorities, including the rebuilding of Old Kenyon following the 1949 fire, kept the project from coming to fruition until after Chalmers' death in 1956, with the firm of O'Connor and Killam being engaged to design Chalmers Memorial Library in 1961. On October 16, 1962, a book brigade of community members made short work of transferring the collection from the old library to the new. The building, a modernist, vaguely international style structure, impressive for its time, was dedicated by one of the late president's closest friends, poet Robert Frost, on October 28, 1962. New athletic facilities were also proposed in the 1940s, and they became essential with the post-war student population explosion. I always think when I see this building that it looks more like a kitchen appliance than a gym. In 1948, the college overcame shortages of both building materials and funds when it received an allocation of half a Navy drill hall from the federal government, with the understanding that Kenyon would pay all disassembly, transportation, and reassembly costs. Although the structure arrived from Camp Perry, Virginia by rail in thousands of pieces, it was quickly erected on a flat site at the bottom of the hill. More than 50 years later, Wertheimer Fieldhouse remained a serviceable, if remarkably unlovely and increasingly problematic, athletic facility for the college. It was demolished in 2002 to make room for construction of the new athletic center, which opened in 2006. At Kenyon, as on many American campuses, the 1960s were an especially cruel time architecturally, giving us such uncomely masonry boxes as Chalmers Memorial Library, Farr Hall, Gund Residence Hall, and the late unlamented Philip Mather Hall, which was attached by an enclosed bridge to the north end of Samuel Mather Hall. Other buildings of the period, including the old Dempsey Hall and Bushnell and Manning Halls, the latter two by noted Philadelphia architect Vincent Kling, were at least moderately more successful. Mercifully, a library designed in the 1960s to take the place of Bexley's Colburn Hall went unbuilt. With the planned introduction of the Cornet College for Women in 1969, Kenyon set about building an entirely new quadrant of the campus. Designed by the Chicago firm of Perkins and Will to contrast with the more formal geometries of the existing campus, the women's campus, when completed, consisted of 3 of an originally planned 4 residence halls, Caples, Mather, and McBride, along with gun commons. The 9-story Caples, which was topped out in 1971, remains the tallest occupied structure in Knox County. At the same time, the college constructed the biology building, Higley Hall, also designed by Perkins and Will, and carried out a thorough renovation of Samuel Mather Hall as it began to create a natural sciences complex. In the late 1970s through the early 1990s, Kenyon constructed several important buildings and remodeled many others, including a number of its most historic structures. In 1978, the Bolton Theater opened with a premiere production of Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Michael Christopher's C.C. Pyle and the Bunyan Derby, directed by Paul Newman of the class of 1949, and starring, among many others, Allison Janney of the class of 1982. Designed by Canadian architect Robert Fairfield, who also provided the plans for the Festival Theatre in Stratford, Ontario. It features a thrust stage. In 1982, the Ernst Athletic Recreation Convocation Center redefined fitness facilities at the college, and in 1986, Kenyon celebrated the opening of Olin Library, designed by the distinguished architect Paul Sun of Shepley Bulfinch. In 1993, students first occupied the award-winning Taft Cottages, designed by the now-defunct firm of Thompson & Rose of Cambridge, Massachusetts. In 1999, James P. Storer Hall, by Graham Gund, a 1963 alumnus, who is now one of the country's preeminent architects, was dedicated, ushering in a new age for music education at the college. Shortly thereafter, he designed Kenyon's Eaton Center, built on the north side of the village near Bexley Hall to house the finance division. Gund's other buildings on campus included the chemistry department's Robert J. Tomczyk Hall, the mathematics and physics department's Rutherford B. Hayes Hall, and the Fishman wing of Higley Hall, all clad in Briar Hill sandstone from the same quarry as the stone for Samuel Mather Hall. As part of the Natural Sciences construction project, Gund and his team carried out yet another renovation of Samuel Mather Hall, thoroughly reorganizing the interior and giving new prominence to the long-neglected rear facade. Gund's largest campus project until recently, the Lowry Center, dedicated in April 2006, has attracted national attention while providing top-notch facilities for athletes as well as casual users. Several buildings by the Gunn Partnership, representing a range of architectural styles, have been completed within the past decade and more, while others are currently under construction. O'Connor House, which sits on College Park Street next to Horvitz House, was designed to harmonize with the other houses in the area, all now given over to academic uses, which date from the 1830s through the late Victorian era. Named for donors Rod O'Connor and Lisa Moreno O'Connor, both members of the class of 1980, it contains offices and classrooms for interdisciplinary studies and the new Center for the Study of American Democracy. Peirce Hall benefited from a 2-year renovation and reconstruction project that saw the demolition of the 1963 Dempsey Hall to make way for a much larger Dempsey Annex, shown here under construction, and after completion, with additional dining rooms and greatly enhanced kitchen facilities. Among the smallest of the new academic structures is a group of cottage-sized buildings for the English department with prominent sites across Wigan Street from Finn House. The first, known as Lentz House, in honor of longtime faculty member Perry C. Lentz of the class of 1964, includes both classrooms and offices. In the summer of 2018, finishing touches were added to the English cottage, housing mainly offices, and to the adjacent Keithley House, named in honor of the mother of trustee Matt Voorhees of the class of 1995, and serving primarily as a classroom building. Until recently, and since the 1970s, the English department had also occupied the historic Sunset Cottage, which is now slated to be restored and assigned to another academic department. 2 other buildings by the Gunn Partnership provide the art history and studio art departments, which had long occupied inadequate quarters, with facilities more in keeping with their valued places in the curriculum. The Gallery and Art History Building opened in August 2011 on a site between the libraries and Cromwell Cottage and known as the Gunn Gallery, includes Kenyon's first high-quality, purpose-built museum spaces. The David and Francie Horvitz Visual Arts Center, named for an alumnus and trustee in the class of 1974 and his wife, and dedicated in October 2012, has also been designed in a modern idiom. The Studio Art Building, located on the western side of the campus, wrapping the northwest corner of the college cemetery, features state-of-the-art teaching and studio spaces that would be the envy of many a larger institution. To address the need for updated student residences, Kenyon has also constructed apartment-style housing to accommodate 124 students on and near the former site of the Bexley apartment complex, and eventually on part of the current site of the new apartments. The new units, known collectively as the North Campus Apartments, and designed to be residential in scale and evocative of local vernacular architecture, were built in 2 phases to address student demand. The Bexley Apartments, constructed in 1956 for seminarians, were demolished in the summer of 2012 to make room for the project. The new apartments, built in 1972 as part of the college's inaugural effort to offer a variety of housing types to students, will be torn down some years from now. Although its fate is now in limbo, the first traditional residence hall to be built at Kenyon in 40 years was approved by the college's trustees before attention was turned to the North Campus housing project. The proposed structure would be one of an eventual two at the south end of the campus on either side of Old Kenyon. Because of the slopes at the edges of the hilltop, both buildings would have walkout bottom stories. Since 2018, the college has found itself in the midst of the largest construction project in its history, funded in part by a record-breaking $75 million gift from an anonymous donor that was announced in 2017. The West Quad project, as it is commonly known, is creating an entirely new quadrant of the campus in the area previously occupied by the Chalmers and Olin libraries and a large parking lot. The new library, to be named Chalmers Library in memory of both the late president and his late wife, poet and the Kenyon Review co-founder Roberta Teal Swartz Chalmers, is rising on this site, as will a new administration building for the admissions and financial aid offices, a new academic structure to host the history, political science, and sociology departments and others, and an underground parking garage whose roof will be planted with grass to become a new open space on campus and the home of a striking sculpture by artist Richard Serra. Over the years, there were a number of structures lost to fire that, unlike Rosse Hall and Old Kenyon, were not rebuilt. Chief among those on the main part of campus was Hubbard Hall, constructed just south of the chapel as the college's first separate library building in 1885. A not particularly handsome structure, it was originally designed as a gymnasium to be built on the current site of Leonard Hall. In 1901, the fireproof Stephen Stack room was added to the rear of Hubbard Hall. Fortunately, it turned out, because Hubbard Hall burned to the ground on January 1, 1910. Although many valuable portraits and historical documents were lost, almost all the books were saved. In place of Hubbard Hall came Alumni Library, which was renamed Ransom Hall in 1958 in honor of then retiring Professor of English John Crow Ransom, the noted critic and poet and founding editor of the Kenyon Review. Some notable buildings on campus and in the village simply outlived their usefulness or stood in the way of progress, and they were torn down. Those that housed such once thriving but long defunct Gambier institutions as the Kenyon Military Academy, shown here in earlier and later incarnations, and the Harcourt Place School for Girls, fell victim to fire or neglect. Among the most notable houses to succumb to the wrecking balls were the ones known as Douglas House, the student home of such luminaries as Robert Lowell, Peter Taylor, and Carl Gerasi, which stood on a portion of the Farr Hall site. Eubank Place, built by Bishop McIlvaine, later used as a residence hall for the Harcourt Place schools for boys and for girls, and finally torn down in the 1950s after years of neglect. And White Wing, named for its first occupant, the aforementioned Marcus Tullius Cicero Wing, which made way for Gun Commons in the late 1960s. Others include the Gambier train station and a former Clifford Place outbuilding used by Peter Neff as a library and much later by Graham Gund as a model for the Cheever Room at Finn House that had been moved at some point to the former site of the Ernst Center. Still other no longer extant structures, such as the barracks that once stood on the site of Lewis, Gund, Norton, and Watson Halls, have gone largely unlamented. The Army surplus units were erected on the site of the former Harcourt Place School buildings to accommodate the college's influx of students after World War II. Those buildings, along with the once lovely Eubank Place, were demolished to make way for the construction of Lewis and Norton Halls in 1953 and Watson Hall in 1956, all with designs by Cleveland-based architects Charles Bacon Rowley and Mead Spencer. Originally a residence hall for Bexley Hall seminarians, Watson was designed as an L-shaped structure, but the northern wing was never built. Most recent buildings to disappear from the campus landscape were demolished to allow for construction on their sites or because they had outlived their usefulness or both, making way for the new studio art facility were Walton House, a classroom and office building that served as Kenyon's president home before Cromwell Cottage was built, and the Wing Center, another classroom and office building that for most of its life served as a faculty residence. The old Chalmers Library of the 1960s and the Olin Library of the 1980s, which occupied the site of the new Chalmers Library, now nearing completion and slated to open in the spring, is slated to open in the spring. This is sort of the demolition porn section of the show. The Ernst Center, although it was considered a state-of-the-art facility at the time of its opening just over a quarter century earlier, had become obsolete years before it was demolished in the summer of 2009, with the plot it once occupied being returned to green space and recontoured to mimic its pre-1980 appearance. And perhaps the most consequential of the recent demolitions, Farr Hall came down as part of a re-envisioning of the heart of Gambier. Before Farr's construction, several relatively small buildings and shops had lined the east side of Gaskin Avenue and created a typical village street scene. The 1960s Farr Hall, an almost architecture-free flat-topped monolith, made little, if any, reference to that history. The recent efforts to revitalize the village center arose not just from the desire to recapture the scale of the old, but also from efforts to see and treat the campus and some contiguous parts of the village holistically. New buildings were designed to recall their predecessors from the 19th and early 20th centuries while providing more commercial spaces and convenience for students and other village residents and visitors alike. The desire to make the downtown area function as a center of activity has also led to the placement of additional facilities in the area. These include a limited number of student apartments above commercial venues, as well as the Rothenberg Hillel House, designed by architect Peter Bloomfield of the class of 1973, and the Cox Health and Counseling Center. In view of concerns about the college's landscape, ranging from accessibility issues relating to Middle Path, to wetland preservation, to the aesthetics of the main approach to the campus, to the health of trees, Kenyon contracted with Michael Van Valkenburg Associates, an internationally known landscape architecture firm, to create a landscape master plan. Among the results so far is a new surface for Middle Path, although it too has proved to be problematic, as well as new lighting and new benches along the artery's length. Likewise, the college has given renewed attention to its athletic fields with the recent creation of a new artificially turfed Benson Field for use by the field hockey team and the men's and women's lacrosse squads. A campus such as Kenyon's is a gift passed from one generation to the next. As architect Alfred Granger observed more than 70 years ago, Quote, there are too few spots in this hustling, bustling country of ours in which one can drink in the beauty of both the present and the past, renew allegiance to the ideals and traditions of our ancestors, and at the same time feel hopeful for the youth of the future, close quote. This campus is one of those places. In the time we pass here, we need to be careful, thoughtful stewards of the buildings and grounds that help create one of the country's most beautiful environments for learning. We need to make sure that succeeding generations look back on this one with appreciation and pride in its accomplishments. So, what does the future hold for the Kenyon campus? Indeed, we might well ask, what does it hold for campuses in general? These days, with news stories about cyber universities, mass-mailed catalogs describing online courses, television commercials for classes you can take in your jammies, and the dislocations now occasioned by COVID-19, the future of the campus as a physical entity, even as an ideal, might seem to be in doubt. While some in academia welcome the notion of campuses without walls, others voice concerns about the loss of the everyday contact between teachers and students that can be a powerful part of the learning experience. Already there's a movement afoot to preserve what is being called the sacred space of the classroom. With the encroachment of development on all sides of Gambier, acquisition or reacquisition of property contiguous to the campus has been deemed essential if the college is to maintain its rural character, and thus an important component of its distinctiveness. The necessity was recognized with the incorporation of a $1 million goal for land acquisition, which was quickly met and surpassed in Kenyon's Claiming Our Place campaign of 1997 to 2002. It was also with that necessity in mind that the college's Board of Trustees created the Philander Chase Conservancy, which focuses on local land use issues. This special purpose entity, initially led by Douglas Givens, is now headed by Lisa Dowd-Schott of the class of 1980, who left her longtime post as Kenyon's Director of Alumni and Parent Programs in 2010 to become the Conservancy's second managing director. There's more than enough to keep her busy, as she is charged with working closely with local landowners, as well as economic and regulatory agencies at the county, state, and federal levels to achieve the Conservancy's goals. Does the rise of distance education, with its implication that the idea of a campus as we know it may become a thing of the past, mean that all the attention paid to the built and natural environments at institutions of higher education will be for naught? The prevailing wisdom at most residential colleges and universities is that there will be room for campuses of all kinds, rural, urban, electronic, in the higher education world of the future. The college is banking on it. The Claiming Our Place campaign, which yielded more than $116 million in gifts, funded more than $32 million in building projects, including new facilities for music and the natural sciences. Vastly improved facilities for athletics and recreation arrived in January 2006 with the opening of the $65 million, 275,000 square foot Lowry Center. The We Are Kenyon campaign, which focused on building the endowment and surpassed its goal of $230 million, funded new facilities for art history, English, interdisciplinary studies, and studio art, as well as new student dining spaces and residences. The current Our Path Forward campaign, which emphasizes scholarship and teaching funds, also offers giving opportunities for facilities. It's difficult to imagine a day when the idea of a college as a physical entity will be obsolete. Campuses around the country, and the college is prominent among them, are the repositories of some of the nation's most distinguished architecture from colonial times to the present. More importantly, campuses are powerful symbols of the aspirations and ideals of American higher education. And most importantly, campuses are the setting for a special kind of learning in a community of people who are all, in one way or another, teachers in their daily interactions. Will Kenyon still exist as a collection of buildings and people on an Ohio hilltop 25, 50, or 100 years from now? The future, of course, has a way of surprising us, but we must continue to plan, build, and renovate to meet the college's needs in the conviction that it will. The campus ideal, introduced here by Philander Chase almost 200 years ago, will, many of us believe, prevail. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
You are welcome.
Thank you so much, Tom. We had a couple of questions come in if
Sure.
you are
Happy.
able to entertain those. All right. The first question we received, one question I had is if you know anything about the 3 pits in the woods behind Hanna and the west wing of Old Kenyon that are supposedly made from the cast off stones from when Old Kenyon has burned. Can you answer anything about that?
It's certainly possible. There were no stones that were completely thrown away because the current Old Kenyon is basically a replica of the original with stones in the same places they were in the building pre-fire. But the backs of some stones were cut off and others were split because the newly constructed Old Kenyon no longer needed to have the 4-foot thick walls that the original building had. It's possible, certainly. I don't know how you would go about proving it. Carbon dating, I don't know, whatever.
And we received another question. Someone said they were a captain of the rugby team and they heard a rumor that the rugby fields were originally there for planes to land on. Is this true?
A number of the fields down at the bottom of the hill were actually part of the airport. Kenyon had an airport for several decades and was actually famous for its flying teams in the years leading up to World War II. World War II sort of put an end to flying as a major sport on American campuses because, of course, non-military airfields were closed for the duration of the war. So yes, I mean it's likely that at least part of the rugby field was originally part of what was called Port Kenyon, the airport.
Terrific, thank you. Someone else asked, what is your favorite building on campus?
That's a really tough one. My students ask this every year. And by the way, it's good to see several of them in the audience tonight. I'd have to say that my favorite building is probably Sam Mather. I love the look of it, and I also love the idea of the architect, Abram Garfield, putting the kind of thought that he did into the building. That building was designed with the idea that pedagogy in the sciences would change over time, and therefore the building would need to be flexible. And at this point, that building has now been gutted 3 different times and completely rebuilt on the interior without touching the exterior walls. So an incredibly well thought out building, in addition to, in my mind at least, being a really beautiful one.
Thank you, Tom. That was my question. And it is a beautiful, I think it's the most beautiful science building ever.
Yeah. Well, that I think is probably definitely true. And Kay had asked me earlier about Rosse Hall and the fact that it's in the Greek Revival style. As I mentioned, the original plan for the building was that it was going to be a great Gothic Revival cathedral. But when Philander Chase left, the faculty got together and decided they really didn't need to spend the kind of money that would require, and that they could do with a considerably smaller building as well. So by the time Chase left, as I mentioned, only the basement level stones had been laid. The entire Rosse Hall, as we know it today, was built from those stones. So that gives you some idea of the size of the building that Chase had in mind. And he had in mind also that because it was the seat of the bishop, it would be the Cathedral of Ohio. But that really didn't capture the imaginations of the faculty members. So they recruited one of their own, Charles Romanov Presserminsky, to redesign it in the Greek Revival style. From the very beginning, though, there was some dissatisfaction with having a chapel in a Greek Revival style building because the Greek Revival style was not associated with Christianity, whereas Gothic Revival was, and was a major part of the reason for building another chapel, the Church of the Holy Spirit, which is Gothic Revival. And it's sometimes called the stranger on campus because it is in that Greek Revival style. I think we're really lucky to have that building, which is another one that I really love, and whose proportions, exterior proportions, are just, I think, magnificent.
Tom, we had another question come in.
Yeah.
Are there architectural plans for the replacement of the new apartments?
There aren't at this point. I think, if it happens sometime soon, which I kind of doubt, they will probably be more buildings that look like the North Campus apartments. So those have been popular, and they do house a good number of students each. I should mention that I was actually a resident of the new apartments when they were new, when they opened in the fall of 1972. I was one of the ones lucky enough to have a room there. Even then, they were a little odd, but they didn't have the problems of mold and rodents and so on that they do now. So it would be really nice to say that we're going to be taking them down soon, but the fact is, especially while we're putting only one student in a room, that we need those apartments to house students.
All right, in the interest of time, we're going to just have one last question, and that is, can you confirm or deny the rumor that Kenyon students needed to be able to fly a plane to graduate before the 70s?
That's a definite no. That was not not a graduation requirement ever.